Hey everybody, this is Pete A. Turner, executive producer of the Break It Down Show. Hey, listen, this is a fun show today. I've got two best-selling, multi-time best-selling authors. They've hit the #1 spot on the New York Times best-selling list. They both have written books that have been turned into movies that you've heard of. Stars who acted in them, who everybody knows, like Bruce Willis, for example. Jim DeFelice and Jerome Preisler are both from New York. They're friends themselves outside of their work. And I thought it wouldn't be interesting to have these guys come on and talk about what they do. They've both written dozens of books. Right now, currently, Jerome writes for the Tom Clancy brand. You don't get picked to do that if you're not good. He's an elite writer. And look, Jim's been on this show any number of times, too. So first off, go back through the catalog. Go to breakitdownshow.com. Look under the guest tab, and you can see Jerome Preisler's been on several times, most recently talking about the Battle of the Bulge and his work with Tom Clancy. And then Jim has been on, and I love his West Like Lightning book, but also American Sniper, of course, and his book. Look, he's got so many books. I could just keep doing this. His book, Ray, who was a combat medic in World War II at Normandy, one of the first guys to get off the boat, and is instantly hit, and then spends the rest of the day until he absolutely collapses, helping render aid to a bunch of people as they landed on Omaha Beach. So incredible, incredible writers who are just simply friends. And one of the best things about creating a podcast, why I always encourage people to do it, is that you have the same opportunity. These guys have become my friends because of the show. We have these wonderful conversations. I know you're going to enjoy this. Here's how you support the show. Share the show. Tell your friends about the show. Get out and buy the shirts. Whatever it is. Rate, review. Oh, those are all powerful things that help push us up in their rankings. The more that people do that and participate in those things, that's like money to us. That's our air. So please, for sure, rate and review, subscribe wherever you listen. That does make a difference. Save the Brave, savethebrave.org. You know what to do. Now here comes Jerome and Jim.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hi, this is Jerome Preisler.
And this is Jim DeFelice, and you are listening to the Break It Down Show.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
How great is this? I've actually wanted to do this for quite some time. For those of you who don't know, Jerome and Jim are writers. They're bestsellers many times over. Jerome's current gig is writing for the Tom Clancy series. And then Jim's always got another book in the case. Jim, you've written over 50 books now, right?
Yeah, some insane number. My wife keeps track. I don't. So
it's a lot of books, either way.
It's a lot of books. Yeah, she keeps saying, get him the hell out of the basement. Because I have to keep, one copy at least, and the basement is just not that big. So we'll have to either I have to stop writing or we have to buy a bigger house or a bigger basement at least.
Jerome, when you look at your writing career, you're prolific as well. When you get towards the end, do you want to have higher quality books, or is it the number? Where do you set your meter in terms of production over not that you guys write bad books at all, but...
Oh, wait a second. Yes. Jerome, I think we're being insulted here. Well, the other thing is, here's my question. He said, as you get towards the end, I mean, is he asking like...
Yeah, when is this end?
But does he mean as you get towards the end of a book, or does he mean as you get towards the end of your career? I mean, maybe he's trying to tell us something. I think he's mean,
or our lives. That's the which could coincide with one or the other.
All of it.
Could be. You should look into his background because I think that possibly, possibly it might be what you just said.
That's right.
He's
I don't know if he's got
plans
here.
Background.
Yeah. I got plans.
He doesn't put it out. But I may actually be changing my address after this.
Yeah, I'm hanging up right now.
We should tell him how we met, though. We actually.
Oh yeah, let's hear that.
Because Jerome and I, not only do we write our own books, or by our own books I mean books that have just our names on the cover. But we also collaborate with other people. And that's actually the way Jerome and I originally met, was on a collaboration. We did a rare thing. We collaborated with each other.
And you know what? The way that came up was I was doing, and this is going back 20 years now. That's how long we've known each other and been friends. And I was working on a series, and a number of things had come up in terms of the publishing schedule, and I knew it was going to be really tight. So we decided to call in another writer, and somebody said to me, well, how about this guy, Jim DeFelice? He's good and he's fast. I said, okay, it sounds pretty good. So Jim and I spoke, and I don't remember exactly if he got a copy of one of my books or saw what I'd done on the manuscript or an outline or whatever. But the way we did it was we did separate storylines that converged. And that was sort of the method that Stephen King and Peter Straub did when they did the Talisman books, which were really successful. And that allowed us to neither one of us was dependent on the other in terms of, I wouldn't have to wait for Jim to get to a certain spot, and Jim wouldn't have to wait for me to get to a certain spot. And we just, Jim just sailed along. I mean, he wrote, 80,000 words in 3 days or something, and it was great. And
it wasn't quite that many.
It was like a week, but
it wasn't 80,000. I don't think.
All right, but it was a lot of words.
It was a lot of words because Jerome had to cut it down.
In a relatively short time. But before I finish on that, I was thinking about this before this conversation, and I was trying to remember how Jim and I ended up going to Yankee games together. And I think it may have been because in that book, one of my characters was stationed at a remote base, and he would, to occupy his time during his down hours, would play this online baseball. And of course, he was a nice guy, so he was a Yankee fan, as opposed to being, say, a Dodger fan. And it may have been that Jim read those pages, because I'm just guessing. I have no recollection of it, but it may have been that way that we started talking baseball, and before you know it, there was 20 years worth of Yankee plans, as well as
Yeah, well, actually, I don't remember our first conversation, but I would guess that it soon devolved into talking about baseball, and I was probably up in the air on whether I was going to do it or not until you mentioned that you were a Yankee fan, and at that point, of course, I had to do it. We have gone to a lot of Yankee games together, but I guess that's another issue. The collaboration, it was. That was, for me, doing it, working on that separate plot line. I think it was a B plot, which, for people who, don't follow the old, that's kind of an old term, probably comes from movies, actually, where it can work in a couple of ways. It could be a parallel to the main story. It could even, just intersect with the main story or not. But it in this case, anyway, it was separate enough that, it could be written separately. And a lot of writers have worked that way. But then, you see a lot of teams that have different, they have different styles. Like my friends, Link Child and Doug Preston, who incidentally also work, they do separate work, but the way that they started collaborating, Doug would write, say, a chapter, and then Link, who had been an editor and actually had been Doug's editor, I believe, before they started working together, would take that chapter and kind of, revise it, massage it a little bit and send it back. And then they would work on the, next chapter. So they're kind of writing and rewriting as they go. And that kind of, I'm not sure if they still do it quite that way. But that seemed to really work for them. And there's different ways, of working with different people. It was good with me and Jerome to be doing separate pieces, because otherwise we'd be, haggling back and forth all the time, as we do at baseball games.
Which conversation are harder, the baseball conversations or the work and writing conversations?
We don't talk too much about writing, do we? Do we, Jerome?
No,
most writers, I think most writers, when they get together, right, unless you're at like something like we were at a writers conference, not that we were both at recently. I don't remember really talking about, we talked about where's the bar.
Yeah, that's about
they're overcharging for these drinks.
Yeah, best Tex-Mex restaurant.
Yeah, boy, this is one of the lousiest receptions we've ever been to. Yeah, we were talking about those sorts of things, and not and where can I get more coffee and real coffee? But I don't know that we it's funny though, because writers a lot of times who get together won't actually talk about writing itself. You might talk a little bit about editors, and complain about agents maybe or something.
It sort of follows a pattern. I'll meet Jim. Jim will be outside Yankee Stadium smoking a stogie, and we'll each vent for about 5 minutes. It's not like we plan it. It's just, we've each been building up now for, since our last game, and frustrations with, all the usual nonsense. And I'll complain and he'll complain. And after that, I think what's interesting, though, is that it's sort of like anybody else. If you think about when you get together with people from work, you end up talking about, and you've known each other a while, you talk more about, well, how's your wife doing? How's your son doing? What's going on with the house? And I think that it's almost a pleasure, not, writing being such a solitary and lonely profession in many ways, where it's just you and a computer screen and you're constantly focused on it. There's, and it's not as if when you walk away from the machine, you can forget about it. Your mind is always going there. I think probably that's one reason that when writers get together, and I can't speak for all of them, but certainly when we get together, it's just kind of refreshing to be able to just blow all that off, because we're both getting out of the house and getting away from our offices. We're actually under the sun, or, well, if we're lucky and it's not a rain out, but you get the picture.
Yeah. So you guys, you don't, I guess at this point in your career, you guys don't get stuck on something like, hey, Jerome, I'm stuck here. What are your thoughts? You guys just don't ever need to do that, right?
Speaking for myself, no. I've always said that I don't believe in anything like writer's block, personally. And I think that, you might get stuck for a little while, but, you take a walk, or you sleep on something. But for me, I've always kind of compared writing to, appropriately enough, again, going back to baseball, to kind of when a baseball player a batter takes his reps, and if he's doing it every day, and he knows what he's going to do, he knows he's going to be in the lineup, then he'll be at his best. If he's got to sit for a few days, or he's benched and he's just worrying about, the slump that he's in, he's going to stay in the slump. The only way to get out of it is just do the work. And I think for most people who write under deadline professionally, it's like any other job. Whether it's not a question of whether you're inspired, or whether you know what you're going to do, or whether you're stuck. You just know that you got to sit down in your chair at a certain time and do the work. That's the way I feel.
Well, for me, I would say every one of those 50 plus, or whatever the number is, books, every one of them, every single one, there's always been a point that I have reached where it's just an insolvable problem. The plot, whatever, whether it's fiction or, fiction, it's usually a plot point or something. There's some sort of problem that cannot be solved. There is no way to go forward. Was the worst decision I've ever made. I should quit this job and go,
Yes.
Be a greeter at Walmart.
Right.
Even that I would probably fail at. It is completely, utterly impossible and cannot be done. And it's not a question of whether I'm going to bang my head against a wall. It's how many walls am I going to bang my head against? And somehow, some way, some miraculous way, so far anyway, I've been able to figure out how to, there's some solution, and usually it's the stupidest or simplest thing in the world presents itself, and it's like, oh my God, that's what to do, and continue. And I've always found that there's always some point. I will say that our processes in terms of writing are very different. Jerome can speak to his, but briefly, Jerome will finish, when Jerome finishes page 1, whatever it is, or page 2, he's not going back to it. Whereas I will write an entire draft of a book. And I'm basically trying to, it's like running with my head down through a forest or whatever, and I'm trying not to stop. Occasionally I'll go back or whatever, but I may leave like some holes for a B plot or a C plot or to figure out something else. If I'm writing a thrillers tend to be very complicated plot-wise, and a lot of times you have a lot of different threads, and you can do that. But I try to get from the beginning to the end. I always go from the beginning to the end and then revise and come back, and won't let anybody read the first draft, and in general won't really talk to anyone about usually not about the book, or at least not in a specific way about the book at all until I'm either way into the second draft or I'm done with that, because I've just found that I guess it's psychological, and now it's just whatever the process is, but I need to have something there. I need to have that lump of clay or whatever, and basically have cut down on the possibilities and kind of narrowed it down before I can come back. I need to have the whole there before I can start to think about the particular parts and polish it up.
Which would drive me crazy. It's interesting. I just to back up a minute on something that your question, Pete, and then what Jim was talking about in terms of hitting that seeming wall where you get to a problem and you think, oh man, did I screw up? And that just happened to me. I'm writing the second book in the Net Force series right now, and it's just it's kind of like Net Force meets John Wick. So I've got this really long and elaborate and complicated action sequence, and it just sort of one piece of action leads to another, leads to another, leads to another, and suddenly what Jim was talking about just happened to me. I just got to the key point in this long action sequence, which is the first third of the book, and I thought, holy crap, I don't know how I screwed up. There's no way my good guys are going to end up here and my bad guys are going to end up there. and it was funny because I really got tense over it, and that was the end of the day, and I was just thinking about it, and I actually sat myself down and said, Jerome, you've been doing this for 30 years. Have you ever not found the way out? And I then answered myself and said, no, you always do it. So once I did that, again, going back to what Jim said, and I don't want to give anything away specifically, but I found what it was I needed to do to make everything work. And it was the simplest thing. It was so easy. It was literally 6 words spread out across 50 pages. And those are all the same word. It was changing, I won't say specifically, it was like changing a road, a 2-lane road to a highway. It was that simple. But you don't see it sometimes. And when it presents itself, you actually question. In my case, I'm thinking, no, it can't be this easy. But it usually is.
So those are solutions you guys find internally, though. You don't have to go outside to somebody else or grab a beer or a coffee with a fellow writer and go, here's where I'm stuck. You guys just know you'll figure it out one way or the other.
In my case, yeah. I think both of us. One thing I think that's interesting about Jim and I is that, a lot of writers write nonfiction primarily and might write a novel or 2 or 3 or whatever the number is. A lot of guys write fiction and might try their hand at nonfiction. There aren't many that I can think of. In fact, I can't think of any other guys, and I'm not saying this to, pat us on the back. It's just something I can't. I've been actually trying to looking around and thinking, well, does anybody else do this? I don't know anybody else who is doing who just kind of jumps between fiction and nonfiction, and guys who other than ourselves, and I'm sure there are others I just don't know about, but for whom fiction and nonfiction are equally important components of our careers. We do a lot of both. And going back to your question, Pete, so there's a lot of things that we run into similar problems, but I don't ever think there's been a time when, again, we've talked about that. And, we're close friends. So there's never been a need in my case, and I'm going to guess with Jim, but he'll tell you, but I don't think so.
I have talked through like controversial type points in terms of nonfiction with editors. I have a particularly good editor at William Morrow that I've worked with, and that occasionally we've talked through stuff before actually giving them the manuscript. The problem with that is that you then, I'd rather an editor, actually I'd rather any reader, but an editor to come to the book kind of fresh and not prejudiced about, a particular issue or something, because maybe I don't know what the issue is, or maybe they're going to, maybe me saying something will kind of prejudice it. But then if they give you notes or whatever, and the notes don't cover that one point, I might, then I might go back and say, well, what do you think about, about such and such? But I think, it's funny, because working on, besides doing books, besides doing, fiction and nonfiction books, I mean, I've done video games and movie scripts, and even way back before I was writing for a living, I did a few plays. And the most collaborative art video games, where you have these massive teams, and the way that kind of the culture there works is that everybody really has some input. Even a tester really has some input in, if you're doing if you're either writing the storyline for the game, or you're a little bit, or a developer, which is not exactly the same thing depending on the game. That's very collaborative. You have the artists, you have the other developers, you have the level designers, you have a lot of people working on that. So there's a lot of things going on, a lot of collaboration, a lot of feedback, a lot of people talking a lot. And that's the way that is. If you're doing a movie, that's the director's medium. The producer will have a lot of input. In my case, my manager will be a real pain in the ass when I finish a script. But the books, I think, even when you're actually collaborating with someone, they're a lot more, it's just you, it's just at the end of the day, especially if it's a novel, and especially if it's, you're the only name on that cover, it's just you, and you're the one that has to make that final decision, input or not.
As Jim was talking, it actually came to me that there's a unique, or a unique case in terms of what I've done, but Jim's done a lot of memoirs with people, and I know that about a year or two ago, I did a book with Bernard King, who's a Hall of Fame basketball player, and it was a memoir written in his voice. And there was a lot of ground to cover in terms of his life and his career. And as with anybody's life, there are always issues that come up where maybe the person's reluctant to discuss them, because after all, when you're writing a memoir, there's going to, by definition, personal stuff is going to come up. And that was an interesting experience, because that really took a lot of patience and a lot of communication, and I wasn't used to that. And I was very fortunate in that Bernard was really game, and the book's name is Game Face, so no pun intended there, but he was really game to make this the best book possible. But again, we're talking about his life, so something that was very serious, or one way or another, whether it was a happy event like the birth of a child, or a traumatic event, or a sad event, the passing of his mother, whatever. These were things that I'm looking at as a writer, and I'm looking at from the perspective of how does this help the book? Where does it fit into a story? But I'm also very aware of the fact that what I'm looking at as a story is another person's life, and so it really requires, for it to turn out right, I think both people sort of meeting more than halfway. You really end up having to, in a sense, merge your sensibilities, and I don't think that always happens, but I think if the book really turns out well, and it ends up being a true collaborative effort, then the two of you end up working with one mind. But it's not easy. We butted heads many times, wound up being the best of friends, and probably will be for life. But that was an interesting an interesting case in terms of what I've done.
Yeah, that reminds me. So somebody, Larry Bond, who's a great thriller writer on his own. Larry and I collaborated on two or three, I think it's two different series. And Larry is very fond of saying that collaborations work best when each person does 90% of the work. So, but coming back to the memoirs, and that's really a different kind of collaboration, and it's tricky because on the one hand, you both, in order for it to be successful, in order to get the stuff that you need to get, both sides have to really, really trust each other. The person that you're working with has to trust that that you're not out to screw them or whatever, and you're going to be diligent and everything else. And on the other hand, you have to trust that that they're going to tell you the truth and be open, etc. But there is a conflict, and you have to, as the writer, where exactly is your ultimate allegiance to the person that you're collaborating with, especially in a memoir, and the way that I do memoirs, is very intense. I spend a lot of time with the people and essentially live with them for a while and back and forth, and at times end up talking to them for hours every day for quite a long, over a long period of time, and you end up knowing all their secrets, and sometimes, or not all their secrets, but some of their secrets, and but ultimately, though, so they become your friend, or they generally, in my case, become my friend. But on the other hand, is my obligation to them, or is my obligation, really to the story and making a story, that's going to be, especially if I've done, and I've just finished working on a World War II memoir, that is hopefully anyway will be read 100 years from now to someone looking for a true story of what happened during the war. And I feel that if push came to shove, and hopefully it hasn't, and hopefully it wouldn't, but would my obligation is to the story and the truthfulness of the story and the presentation of the story, rather than the person that I'm working with. It's a difficult yin and yang there. Probably somebody will say, well, some lawyer somewhere will look at the collaboration agreement and say, bullshit, there's a a contractual agreement to this, right, to this person. So
I think, for me, I think in the end, it has to be to the book. But a point that I'll attach to that is that what you hope is that the person you're doing, again, we're talking about a memoir type thing, the person you're doing the book with, despite whatever friction may arise during the course of the project, also has that allegiance to the book, whether or not they're aware of it or not. Because after all, if they got into the project wanting to tell their story, most people do want to tell it accurately and truthfully, I think. In my case, that's always been true. I think what ends up, sometimes the truth of what happened might differ from someone's memory. You might be working with a person who remembers something one way, and then if it's a famous person, or if it was somebody who was involved in a story that was in the news, you do the research for the background research, or you speak to other people, which I always do, and you find out that that the person's memory is faulty.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
And then it becomes, and the person may, if you're lucky, he'll say, wow, and that's great. I didn't remember it that way. But if the person remembers it a particular way, then it becomes also a bit of a dicey issue. And another thing that Jim and I, again, I'm moving off on a little bit of a tangent, but this is one thing Jim and I have discussed that I think is interesting. In doing World War II history, or any kind of military history that involves combat, which, of course, if it's military history, it usually does, you draw on a lot of different sources, and among them are the official post-combat or post-action reports, And, you know, if you're talking about World War II, obviously something like Normandy or a lot of the battles, things were very chaotic. And you read the reports and you read some of the official histories, but then you start doing research, and what you've read in the official reports doesn't make sense.
Yeah,
And,
often the after-action reports are wrong. I mean, clearly wrong.
Really wrong. And, you know, one thing that we've discussed is that we've both run into situations where the people involved didn't necessarily remember exactly what happened. And you've got to, and then again, where is your allegiance? You know, you've worked, maybe one of the sources is somebody you've grown close to, and he's giving you the story, and maybe he's kind of, you know, you use the word character, but he's a person whose story is a thread throughout the book, and his recollection of where he was at a given time, maybe even what outfit he fought with in a particular battle or number of days, period of time, is wrong, and you know it's wrong. And the way I've handled that is I usually go with what I come to believe is true through my research. But what I will typically do, and I don't know, I think Jim's done the same. I'll let him address it for himself. But what I'll do is then I'll address it in the notes and pretty much just outline a case almost the way a lawyer would, and saying, well, here's you know, some of the conflicting accounts, and here's why I arrive at this conclusion.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, have that issue in the book that, you know, as I was saying, I just finished working on. That'll be out this year. It's called, you know, Whatever It Took. And it was a guy who was, not to give the entire book, you know, history here, but he's a paratrooped on D-Day, fights in Normandy, he gets captured and goes to a prison camp and all this stuff. The official records have him go into a place that is almost impossible for him to have gone. At the same time, somebody in the Army told him that he had gone to another place that, again, is even further away and almost impossible for him to have gone. And he has a memory of a third place. And it's kind of piecing everything together, his descriptions and everything. You know, his memory is probably the closest to the actual truth. So you know, and how to navigate between all those, and at the end of the day, explain and note that, you know, well, this is what they say, this is what that said. We actually think this is what happened, but admittedly, you know, you can't prove a negative, and the people that kept these original records were wrong. You know, I did a book on the Rangers at Dieppe, called Rangers at Dieppe, and they were the Rangers' first land action that the American soldiers are involved in during World War II in Europe. And I have all the after action reports, and this one battle, and there were only 4 guys there. And there's about, conservatively speaking, 10 different versions of what they did, and they don't really match. So, you know, it's like, so sometimes memories in the heat of things kind of vary a bit.
There was one guy, paratrooper, I wrote about in First to Jump, which is about the Pathfinders in World War II. And when he jumped, he quickly was near, a shell went off near very close to him. And he didn't know it at the time, but he had a concussion, and a pretty severe concussion. And later on, you know, in reading some of the accounts that other people told, they would ask him questions about who he was, and he wouldn't even remember. But he was part of a lot of different interesting things that happened that night before the invasion of Normandy. And the only problem was, most of the time he didn't know where he was. and you know, so it was really, it's just like Jim was saying, it was really a struggle to kind of piece together where he was at a given time. And fortunately, you know, the whole time I was writing the thread of the story that involved him, I was really hoping I'd get it right, because he was a really nice and colorful guy, and I just, you know, felt obliged, obviously, to really do right by him, as well as by the book, of course. But anyway, he was happy with it at the end, and whether he remembered doing these things or not, he was. I saw him. Unfortunately, he's passed away since then. But he was at different veterans meetings after the book came out, and he was showing the book off to his friends. So I kind of mopped my brow and said, "Wow,
That's a plus."
Right. Yeah, as long as he likes it, I'm happy.
Yeah.
One thing that the other set of misconceptions or maybe misinformation or whatever that you have to deal with are is popular. What the popular kind of take on certain things are. And I mean, you used to run, writing a techno thriller, a lot of times you would run into this. People, just to give a silly example from one book, in a situation, a submarine had launched 4 torpedoes and 2 of them hit. And, I think it was an editor who came back and said, "Oh, no, nobody would believe that. You'd only fire the 1 torpedo and you would hit." And in actual fact, in the circumstances at the time, and it was based on total fact, the percentage of hit would be, they would have fired at least 4, because the percentage of a hit there would have only been, you would have been fairly lucky to get just 1 torpedo out of the 4 to hit. Of course, we had 2. It's funny. There's much further things than that people believe, and sometimes you're not only you're trying to figure out what the facts are, but then you're trying to figure out, well, how do I deal with what the public perception or the common perception of such and such is,
That's interesting. When I'm collecting intelligence or whatever, and I'll bring back some notes, it's oftentimes quite different than what the patrol saw, because I'm looking from different angles, different perspective, different level of experience. And I often have to put within my observations, like what I call agent's notes, right? So I'll provide that context of, it might seem like this is a normal thing, but this is why this happened or whatever. Right. Are you guys taking that and putting that back in the notes? Because you don't necessarily put that in the book to say, you might want this to be 1 torpedo fired, but here's why they fire 4 in this situation.
Well, in that particular one, and if it's fiction, you don't. Yeah, there are no notes. Generally speaking, you're not going to write with notes. Certain books, Rogue Warrior, we would play with that sometimes and have footnotes. But usually you don't have the opportunity to have that kind of explanation. So you've got to work it somehow into the narrative, or just in that case, I told him what he could do with his misinformation. But yeah, in nonfiction, well, it depends though, because in something like West Like Lightning, which was a nonfiction book about the Pony Express, part of the fun and part of the texture of that book is, or there's different variations of the story, and here's one variation, and hey, but maybe you like this variation, so it kind of fits in there. But I think very somber, like the World War II histories, or the things I've done on the Iraq and Afghan wars, whether it was American Sniper or Every Man a Hero, whatever, conflicts like that, there's one straight narrative because they want the book to read quickly, and that so any involved explanations would go or have gone in the notes, unless it's somehow germane to the story. I mean, the thing with Every Man a Hero and Whatever It Took, which is the new book, those are memoirs with men who are very, very, very old. And part of the kind of the underlying theme of those books, besides war and how you save people in war, and how you and kind of the flip side of that, what you have to do to get through to survive in war, which is what the new book really is about. Alongside of those themes, the other, another theme, because of their age and because we're losing these guys, is memory, and how temporary memory is and how fragile it is. And just I had a discussion recently with the editor on Whatever It Took, saying, hey, you're pointing out that, maybe he's not remembering, this correctly. And I said, yeah, that's the theme of the book. That's important to the book, that, this is what I remember and this is what the context was, but I'm old and I don't remember this guy's name, and that's important. So,
yeah, there's a bunch of things, details, where I know plenty of details in some cases. Other times I'm like, I can't remember even what unit that was, because there were so many units, so many places, so many patrols. It's so easy to put the wrong memory at the wrong thing. So I can't even imagine 70 years from now doing that,
Yeah.
Yeah, and that is, and it really is part of the story. I mean, I think it's a very good point.
I want to know what I want to know from Jerome is whether I'm going to change topics for a minute, and I want to know if he writes with an outline and what kind of outline he works with. Because that's one thing that's a question people always often ask me. New writers, especially, are asking, what sort of outline do you work with? What's your process?
Only under threat of death will I do an outline. Usually, I've never liked doing outlines at all. I usually have much of the time for editors when you're and your publisher. So what I'll generally do is write as short an outline as I can get away with. Like if I can get away with 2 paragraphs, that's great. And like with the book I'm doing now, that's actually what I did. I think I did a 2 or 3 page paragraph outline. It's a double-edged sword because on one hand, I certainly have a very strong idea of where the story's going in my mind, but I like to leave open as many options as possible. Going back to what we were talking about earlier, sometimes those options can lead you into a wall or a tree or over a cliff. So that's, I guess, the downside of it. The upside, again, is that you leave open a whole lot of different possibilities. And for me, I like that. So I generally know where it's going to end up. I don't usually know a lot about the middle of the book. And I know a lot about the basic premise. The story is going to be that, somebody develops a particular weapon and is going to try to start a war between this country or that country, to make a very simple plot up right now. But that might be what I know. I might know what the weapon is. I have certain ideas what I want to do with the characters, but I really, I don't usually work from an outline at all. And even in the nonfiction, it's pretty much the same. I might, obviously, what I'm doing, it's the constraints are what happened, what the story is, and the story is what it is. What happens within the overall outlines of that story, if it's first to jump and it's about the Pathfinders, I really didn't know going in exactly which Pathfinders I would follow throughout the course of the book. When I did a book called Codename Caesar, which was about a sub-to-sub battle in World War II, there was a lot of ways I could take that book, and I really didn't know which direction I was going to go in until I was in it. And that's just the way I've always done it. I mean, since I wrote my first book at 11 years old, that's what I... which I never finished, by the way, probably because I couldn't figure out the end. But
you hadn't outlined it.
but that's how I do it.
I have to know the end. I have to know that I can end it before I do it. And to me, that means, and it means slightly different things if it's fiction or nonfiction. But I will always know. I will always have an idea of what the plot points are, what the turns in writing thrillers, which primarily would be the fiction that I write, the novels, and even more specifically, techno thrillers. They're very they tend to have extremely complicated plots and reversals and all this. And so I will try to have thought out the story and an ending and where the major plot points are. And that goes also for nonfiction before I start. And to that extent, I have an outline. Now, whether I actually follow the outline or not, or even look at the outline after I've started writing, it depends on the book and the circumstances. And I have, as Jerome was alluding to, a lot of times when you're selling a book to an editor, especially fiction, and this doesn't always happen, but often in fiction, they want a synopsis of the plot in the book. and which basically is kind of a fancy outline. You're kind of telling what's going to happen in a few pages as opposed to 400 pages or 500 pages. And I must confess that there have been a few times when the book was more than a little different than the synopsis, but they've never really totally called me on it. So I've never been called on that.
Another author we have on the show is Kat Connor. She writes, she's got this thing called the Bite series, and it's about an FBI serial crime investigation team. And she's on the latest book, and she was on a walk, and the end came to her, and then she started doing a reverse outline from that end to determine the story. Do you guys ever use that tool at all? Hey, this is Pete A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here, and if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it. Do you guys ever use that tool at all?
I don't necessarily use it as to do that, but I have often gotten the ending, even before I was going to do and work to the ending. A lot of times, though, the ending has changed. I remember I was working on one of the Dreamland books, and the original ending that I had, this is maybe a quarter of the way through the book at the time. And these are long. Dreamland, for people who haven't had the pleasure, are books that I do with Dale Brown, and actually, Dale has some input, but basically I write them. I knew as I'm working there that the ending wasn't going to work, and so all of a sudden, suddenly this is becoming a bigger and bigger problem. And then one day, actually, I was working out, and the ending just came to me, and I stopped. Something I never do, but I stopped working out and just went and wrote down the ending, and then just changed everything, and everything. Didn't even look at the outline or the scenario that I had written up before. So, but yeah, the one advantage of the real advantage, I think, of computers is that you can set up the way that you're physically writing the story, so that you can make those kind of changes somewhat easier. Whether if you're using, like, let's say, Microsoft Word, and you're using the outline function or some other function, you can drop back and forth.
Yeah.
I don't know how the guys who typed, or God forbid, I just watched, or not too long ago, saw Little Women, and how she would write, longhand. How would you change a character's name there? You just wouldn't. You can't change the character's name. You can't go back and change anything. Whereas the computer, I'm done.
Yeah.
Jim, did you write your first books on computer? First published books? Or were you still using?
Yeah, I've always written books on computer. Yeah, I think before then, plays were on a typewriter, I believe. But I think the first book was on a computer.
My first two novels were done on a typewriter, and it was like the first kind of the first electric typewriter that had this a minuscule memory, so that it could you could go back and type over the letter E and replace it with an I or something. And it's interesting because I go back and I wrote, I think again it was either 2 or 3 novels like that, and I look back and I wonder, wow, I almost wonder how I was able to pull that off. It's weird. And one thing, here's an interesting thing, though, that may even answer that question. The first novel that I wrote, I had a computer that was a Kaypro. I don't know if you remember these old Kaypro computers. They basically looked like giant valises that you put on or suitcases that you would put on your desk, and they didn't have a hard drive. You would have 2 floppy disks, and one floppy disk was where your data was stored, whatever you were working on, and then there was a really rudimentary word processor that would go in the other drive, so that would be your other disk. And that was before Microsoft Word. Actually the first thing was called WordStar, one of the early word processors. And anyway, they would tell you back in those days when you were using the floppies that, don't put more than 30 pages or something on the floppies, because they would warp like cheap phonograph records would, and then you'd lose all your data. And
right.
you'd be screwed. So, of course, I don't listen to this, and I'm writing, and I swear I had I believe it was the first 90 pages of a novel on a disc that went bad. Oh. And it was just, but here's the thing that I'll never forget. Of course, after the panic and banging my head against all the walls and looking for new walls that Jim was talking about, I realized, well, I still got to go back to writing this book. And I was basically thinking, well, I got to write it from scratch. But somehow I sat down and I started writing. I don't have any proof because I don't have the disc that was badly damaged. But I would say that the way the book ultimately turned out, those 60 to 90 pages were probably nearly identical to the original pages. And it's not that I normally have a great memory, but it was just that when I started writing, it was like one thing led to another. And before I knew it, I was just knocking out the words that I'd written. And the reason I bring this up is I think that was probably more the way that you work on a type when you were doing stuff on typewriters, where you kind of had all this stuff in your head, and then it was just a question. The problem was that when you made a change, you're retyping the whole manuscript or whole chapters,
yeah,
and you have a garbage can overflowing with paper.
Yeah.
So, but like Jim said, the process has really changed tremendously.
One thing to kind of jump back to something that you had said towards the, in the opening about writer's block and stuff, and getting stuck. And one thing that I've found, helpful and maybe might help other people is that if I'm working, and typically not only on a computer but on one specific computer that I always write on, and while I have plenty of other computers and laptops, is really just one that I can really, really write on. But if I'm stuck on something, what I have found is that changing the medium of how I'm working, and to go literally writing longhand on a yellow pad, a lot of times kind of get me unstuck, where I'm just kind of like for whatever reason, the mind just kind of works in a different way, and then retype it. And almost, it's like Jerome, like Jerome's talking about, kind of regaining the thread and, kind of jump starting it.
I do exactly the same thing, Jim. I don't do it longhand because I can't read my own handwriting. But what I'll do is when I go for a walk in the morning, I might be thinking about something that I'm stuck on or trying to figure out. I'll just start writing on Notepad on my iPhone. And it's exactly what you're saying. It's just using a different device, a different medium. It just frees you up a little bit for whatever reason.
A friend of mine who's a playwright and screenwriter, Bill Batzone, his method is what he will do is he will every morning with his coffee and whatever, coffee and bourbon, whatever it is, he will reread the last, I think it's 2 pages or 3 pages of where he had stopped the day before, and then rewrite those pages and use that to jump him into, kind of the next scene or whatever is happening in the, the movie or the play or whatever he's working on. Another technique, now this one I stole from A Movable Feast by Hemingway, is Hemingway, when he would write a next scene or section of the book or short story was going to be, so that when he started, he's jump starting from something that he would he knows where he's going to go. And a lot of times when I stop for the night, I'll put a couple of notes on what happens next, and in the next morning I'll pick up there.
I use both those techniques. I remember years ago.
You stole them from me.
No, I remember.
This podcast is over, man. This guy's like stealing all my shit.
No, I actually remembered before I was a professional writer. Anyway, I saw Truman Capote on the Tonight Show or something, and he was would talk about the torture or the hell that it was getting up and looking at the blank piece of paper in the morning, because of course he worked on a typewriter in his time, and he would go back and look over what he'd done the day before and then start, just so he wasn't staring at the emptiness.
Yeah.
I like to go over what I did. Actually, I play both games with myself, sometimes in the middle of a sentence.
But like looking back at your work, tell me that the worst day of your life isn't the day that the copy edit comes in and you see, that you did not write it as perfectly as you thought. Because the best day of your life is the day that you finish that draft is perfect. The book will never ever be as good as that day that you finished. And then the copy edit comes and you're totally deflated. And first of all, of course, the copy editor is a total asshole that day. Totally missed it. Is horrible. Where you should go back to school and all this stuff. And then as you're working on it, you're realizing, I didn't do the superb job I did. That is the worst day. And then after
all I know is that usually when Jim and I do talk writing, it's the day the copy edits.
That's the day it hurts. Yeah. So recently, a bunch of folks got mad. They dug up Laura Ingalls Wilder and called her a racist because of what she wrote in her books. And, that kind of stuff bugs me because she's a person of her time. She lived in a place that's completely foreign to anybody who's criticizing her. But do you guys in any way worry about, things that might be perceived as insensitive or racist or a problem? Shit. And at this time, 6 months from now, just today I had to edit out a word for a client. And that word's considered offensive now. I wrote and said the word Oriental in the proper academic sense the other day, and someone said, "Oh, I don't know if you should say that." And I'm like, "Yeah, but I know what the word means. It doesn't mean it's not going to be offensive, and the word Oriental probably will continue to age poorly." But what are your guys' thoughts on that? On digging up somebody who's been dead 150 years, or looking back at a book and putting a modern perception on something that was written in the time?
So you're asking the guy whose son went to a school where there were protests on campus because a movie based on his book was shown.
Yes.
I don't know. That stuff happens. I mean, we had the thing that I don't like. We had the editor and I had I want to very explicit what was going on in this. Since I'm talking about American Sniper, having Chris call the people who was fighting against savages right away in the beginning of the book, not only to set the tone, but to show what he thought about, because it's about it's his memoir, what he thinks. We had quite a lot of discussions about whether to do that or not, and they were not necessarily, they were somewhat polite, but in the context, probably pretty. As far as I'm concerned, you do what things that will bother me after I'm dead. I probably, will, if you still fear things 150 years later, I don't know how it works, would be the mistakes I made or the things I thought I could have done better or something. The fact that I'm of my time, the fact that I tried to tell the truth to the best of my ability, and that goes for fiction as well as nonfiction, and failed. Those are the failures that bother me. It's unfortunate that I haven't evolved yet, but I hope I've evolved in my personal life. But, you judge a writer by what they do and in their time, and and not to pick on her, then you have somebody like Ezra Pound, for instance, who is a phenomenal poet, but also a traitor to his country. Does that, and an anti-Semite and all of these other things, does that take away from from the power of his poetry? That's a legitimate question. That's actually a question for a graduate seminar.
I was going to say, and it's one that I couldn't answer.
Yeah.
I pretty much feel the same way Jim does. One quick thing I'll mention before we go on that question is, in the first the Ned Force book that just came out, Dark Web, I actually have a long sequence in which a kid who's autistic is abducted by the villain and put through a whole lot of very difficult ordeal. And when I turned the manuscript in, I had discussed, my editor was a little concerned about that because he felt that it might appear as though we were exploiting somebody who has autism for the sake of a thriller, of dramatic tension in a thriller, or, you know, an exciting scene. And I had to actually examine why I put that in there, and I really didn't think of it like that. In my mind, you know, I myself have worked with people, done volunteer work with people who have different disabilities, and I know people who have autism. And for me, it was really just a character, and it was important to present that character accurately. And it was also a situation where, within the context of the story, the villain was like a wolf looking for the most vulnerable person around. And he saw this little kid with a shirt that indicated he had autism, and he homed in on him in a crowd. And in the reality of that situation, when I'm in it and writing it, that's what this guy would have done. So I basically made my case to the editor. He actually agreed to it and said, okay, we'll run with it. And what I just did for myself, I have a friend who has an autistic kid, and I shot a few scenes off to her and said, are these accurate? And she just said, yeah. Or she actually gave me a few pointers on how to make the scene a little bit more accurate. And that's what I did. But I was really glad in this instance that the editor had enough confidence in what I was doing to just say, okay, let's go for it.
I think another thing, I mean, people will occasionally mistake the fact that something that a character does. I'm remembering, and this is actually from a different series, but there was a character who was anti-Semitic. He was a villain. It was one way of, and obviously a villain for many reasons. That was certainly a big reason. And, you know, occasionally, you know, some people, there was a real danger. I think, you know, one reader, but, you know, one vocal reader, you know, say, well, how can you do that? You know, you're anti-Semitic and et cetera. And it's like, well, no, that's that character, you know, and that's right. Appropriate for that thing. And read till the end of the book. And,
right, exactly.
But there is that danger, you know, and you know, but as Jerome, I think one of the things that Jerome's alluding to, though, is that, you know, sometimes it's not a question of your own, you know, whether you're personally prejudiced or not, but whether did I portray that person or that situation or that character in a way that will be perceived the way that I want it, you know, more or less the way that I want it perceived.
Right.
And, you know, I don't want people, you know, making fun of autistic, you know, my autistic friends. Actually, I have a couple that across the street, but I don't want people making fun of them. So,
right.
But did I miss something when I was portraying them?
Yeah, yeah. Well, this has been awesome, fellas. I mean, I appreciate you taking the time to talk. We didn't even get time to talk about the Yankees. I guess we'll have to do another one. But I love it.
We'll have to do the Jim and Jerome sports broadcast.
That's right.
Yeah, direct from
we'll do it live from Yankee Stadium. How about that? We'll call you up from our seats.
Great. And we'll do it, and I'll be hopefully at Dodger Stadium. We'll just go coast to coast, stadium to stadium.
All right, I like it.
That'd be good.
A game within a game.
What would be even better would be we could be at a Yankee-Dodger game all together and see how that goes.
Are the Yankees playing the Dodgers this year? I don't know.
Didn't we start out that? We'll have to look at the schedule.
Yeah.
The only problem with that is somebody's going to leave unhappy. So
I'm not that. It's fine. I'll sacrifice a Dodger win, and that's fine. I just want to spend the time and hang out with you guys because the Dodgers are fine. They're going to be okay.
Well, I have to warn you. Neither Jerome nor I are very good losers.
That's the East Coast and you guys. Here we're like, hey, look outside, it's sunny. Let's go get tacos, and then we leave.
No, it's like Jerome. I can imagine is pushing his way through the turnstiles at the subway, and I'm just like gunning the car through traffic and saying, whereas if we win, it's like, yeah, go ahead. You go ahead.
Everybody.
You want to go? Go. Right.
I love it. Well, fellas, again, seriously, thank you very much. It's always fun to do these, and I can't wait to do another one.
Same
Thanks
here.
for having us.